morning. My name is Ben Bingle. I'm the director of the DeKalb County Nonprofit Partnership. I want to thank you for joining us today for this webinar on the essential elements for nonprofit boards. We have a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, we'll be recording today's webinar, and the recording will be sent to each of you later on by email with an evaluation form so you can provide feedback about this training. We encourage you to share the recording with others in your organization who may not be able to attend live right now. We also have everyone muted, but feel free to use the Q&A and chat features that are built into Zoom, and we're going to save some time at the end to address any questions that you submit. We'll plan to have about 40 to 45 minutes of content today, and then around 10 to 15 minutes for questions and discussion. So with that, we're excited to offer this topic today. It's been over a year since we last offered the Essential Elements training, and it's been rebooted slightly. In fact, this is part one of a three-part series that we're offering over the next couple of weeks, and we invite you all to attend those as well. Leading us through today's training is Matt Gayer from the Catalogue of Philanthropy in Washington, D.C., and I want to share a little bit about his background. Matt is co-executive director of the Catalogue for Philanthropy of Greater Washington, D.C., which is the region's only locally focused guide to giving and volunteering. They focus on small nonprofit organizations with the goal of creating visibility for these nonprofits, fuel their growth with philanthropic dollars, and create a movement for social good in the region. Since 2003, the Catalogue has raised more than $40 million for their network of vetted nonprofit organizations. Before joining the Catalogue, Matt worked in healthcare consulting at the Advisory Board Company. He's a Truman Scholar, holds a Master of Public Administration degree with a focus on nonprofit management from Syracuse University, and earned a bachelor's in public policy and political science from Southern Methodist University. Matt loves all things DC and enjoys exploring the hidden gems the city has to offer. And this is the second time that he's presented for DCNP, so he's a great partner to the nonprofit partnership here. So welcome, Matt. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Ben, and thank you all for having me. Excited to dive into this topic today. We know in general, as Ben mentioned with the Catalogue, we work with over 400 local grassroots nonprofits across the DC area. But especially this past year, we've been doing kind of capacity building for nonprofits from across the country. And almost universally, even pre-pandemic, we often heard boards were one of the number one issues or opportunities for nonprofits to address or to think about. So when we talk today about these essential elements for nonprofit boards as the first part of this three-part series, we'll be able to dive into a little bit about what makes a board effective and talk a little bit about why, especially right now, having an effective and engaged board is more important than ever. So on that last part first, and just to frame some urgency around this, again, this is an evergreen topic that people are always talking about and thinking about in the nonprofit space. But especially right now, we know boards are incredibly vital to our organizations thriving, growing, kind of remaining resilient for a few different reasons, right? So the first is just when we think back over the past year, 15 plus months, both in terms of strategy and decisions, our boards have possibly been more engaged than they ever have been before, and have had to be, right? There's been really tough financial decisions to make, really challenging budgeting process to go through once or twice already so far, and then a lot of strategy, right? That's been had to be made for the organization. That depending on where you are in your own board, maybe rested more with the ED or more with the board itself. But either way, theoretically at least, we've had a lot of opportunity for the board to be strongly engaged in the direction of the organization over the last 15 months. With that in mind, though, we also know it's a really difficult time for board engagement overall. So some organizations have brought their board members back to in-person meetings, but many organizations have still been meeting virtually with their board now for over 15 months, right? So just like for our staff that have been virtual or were virtual for a long time there, that makes engagement with the board harder, right? They're not seeing each other, and they're not having those social connections together they typically would at a meeting. So it's something we need to think about in terms of how we're engaging them, since their experience has largely been virtual, right, for the past year probably. The other thing here is that it's more difficult right now, right, to connect board members easily with impact opportunities, right? So maybe we used to have board members visit our programming and can't right now because of COVID and kind of safety protocols. It could just be that board members have a lot on their plate, so they're not thinking as much right now about the impact we make. But we know the number one indicator of a successful board member is that they're passionate about what we do. And that they remain passionate about what we do during their board service. So that kind of lack of connection with the mission of the organization this past year also makes that engagement tougher. So basically we're asking more of them at a time that we're probably engaging them a little bit less. We know that's a real challenge. So we'll talk today about things that aren't just relevant now, but are kind of evergreen, will always be important to board engagement, but we can definitely apply now during a difficult time for engaging our boards. So we'll talk about a few different specific tips and tricks today for structuring our boards to kind of drive engagement. We'll separately talk next time about board recruitment, right, to how to get the right people on the board in the first place. But today we'll talk about that structure, that culture, and a couple of different engagement tips for how we can create an environment of engagement for our board of directors. Before we dive into those tips, though, I just want to get us all on kind of the same page and kind of level set about what a board is and isn't. And the types of boards that are out there, because not all boards are made equally. And we'll talk about that in just a second here. So at the end of the day, a board, right, is part of our leadership team, right? The executive director is one side of the coin, the board is the other. We often at organizations, how that plays out is that it's very different. It's either we often see a very strong ED-led organization with a weaker board, or a very strong board with more of an ED that's kind of reporting almost to them on a regular basis. Ideally, though, these are two kind of equal halves of the leadership coin, right? That's kind of driving the organization. The board's really focused on governance. So at a high level, not the day-to-day kind of weeds and kind of programming, but the strategic direction of the organization, right? Ensuring that level of integrity in the work the organization does. Secondly, at the end of the day, the board is ultimately the backstop, right? If the ED quits, the board is the one that has to like find a new one, right? If there's a scandal at the organization, the board is the one that's technically, ultimately responsible. So the board is that kind of backstop for the organization as well. Then obviously kind of hand in hand with governance, there's a fiduciary responsibility, financial responsibility, that the board's overseeing the financial health of the organization and the assets of the organization. So with that, kind of what does that really mean that we should expect a board member to do, right, on a regular basis? What do boards do typically? They're involved in planning, right? So our strategic planning, our budgeting, our goal setting, all that's going to be a strongly board involved process, if not board led. Actively engaging with each other to discuss the direction of the organization, right? So there should be an element of collaboration and conversation, ideally, on a fully engaged board. Representing the organization, at events, participating actively in fundraising for the organization, and helping kind of be an advocate for the work. And then there's an expectation that they're staying up to date on the materials we're sending, right? They're reading those financials, they're reading the program updates, and they're staying up to date on kind of what's going on with the organization. So if those two things are kind of really high level, probably the most important part of this kind of first section here that I'll just spend a minute on is the fact that while those are the broad responsibilities, the broad definition of a board, actual board service varies widely from one organization to the next, right? So even just for organizations that are on the call today, I can almost guarantee you that the way your boards function probably vary across the spectrum we're going to talk here in just a second. And we often say, right, for board members, and when we're doing training for board members specifically, that if you've served on one board, you've served on one board. The next one you serve on might be drastically different, right, in a variety of ways. So we'll talk about that here in just a second. So when we talk about boards kind of existing on a spectrum, it really is a spectrum from kind of working board to governance board, right? So at a high level, a governance board is kind of a fully formed board that really is, as we talked about at the beginning, focused on those high level strategic direction of the organization, right? So they're thinking about the strategic goals, the strategic plan, the budget, right? They have that, you know, financial management and governance hat on, but they're really out of the weeds of kind of any type of programmatic decisions or choices, right? And they're really there to help, you know, support the executive director as a sounding board, but then also just make sure kind of like the buffer on like a bowling lane, right? And making sure the organization stays within the kind of strategic mission and financial health and good practices and stuff. So this is often what we think of as a traditional board, right? They're pretty high level. They're really thinking about long-term stuff and just kind of there to make sure financial health and management moves forward. And there's usually a pretty strong fundraising component of this as well. So if this is one spectrum and kind of the traditional idea of a board, the other end of the spectrum is a working board, right? So this is a board of directors that usually for a smaller nonprofit, right? And we'll talk about some of the differences here and organizations that have one or the other. But a working board is going to be a board of directors that still has all that governance and financial responsibility, right? So they still, they are responsible for the strategy of the organization, the financial health of the organization, but they also are involved in more day-to-day type projects. So the executive director might be bringing in on a working board one or two folks like help manage their social media, right? Or you know, one level up, help create a marketing strategy, right? Maybe staff are still implementing, but the working board is kind of creating the strategy for it. The board might be helping with doing some research or prospect research, right? For development research behind the scenes for programming, right? They might be doing some staff training at different times, but they're just more involved in that day-to-day work. Neither one's right or wrong, right? Obviously, the traditional role for the board is definitely more governance, but we know for small organizations, especially that have limited staff capacity, right? That working board model is really important as an added capacity, right? And this really becomes a working board that's kind of, you know, partial governance, partial kind of pro bono volunteering. So again, you know, smaller organizations typically have working boards, newer organizations, and then the longer an organization's around or the bigger it gets, the more it typically trends towards governance. So some of those distinctions, again, a governance board is going to be that kind of core leadership group focused on those governance and financial responsibilities, where a working board really is kind of an extension of staff, right? So a typical board role, but also some project-based work as well. Generally, again, working boards, smaller, newer organizations, governance boards, larger, and have been around for longer. Working boards also, you know, for board members themselves, there is more to do, right? Which is sometimes hard from engagement, but also sometimes engagement's easier for this group because they have expectations, right? And they have set work they have to get done, and they can see the tangible impact of that work sometimes. Whereas governance board, a little more steady flow of work, probably a little bit less to do in most cases, but also may feel more removed, more disconnected, right? And we might struggle more with engagement. So at the end of the day, very few boards are 100% one or the other of these, right? Inherently, working boards also do governance. Many governance boards, especially for smaller, medium-sized nonprofits, still have project-based work to do, right? So somewhere on the spectrum is where most boards lie, but it's important to kind of identify where ours is to think about what we want from board members and what that engagement's going to look like. So with that and kind of context for thinking about the type of board that we probably have or that we want to have at our organization, we're going to go through a few different tips or tricks on a few structure, policies, engagement committees about how to create an environment of engagement for our board members. Again, at the next two trainings, we'll talk about recruitment. We'll talk about other ways to kind of personally and individually engage them at meetings. But today we'll talk about creating that ecosystem of engagement for them. So the first policy we're going to talk about to implement on our boards to kind of drive that engagement is an individual commitment form. So this is actually an annual agreement that all board members, new or who have been there for a while would sign. It was basically a document, usually about 1 page, pretty simple, that just sets out expectations for them, right? So it's really just setting out, hey, across this next year, I as a board member am going to commit to, things like meeting attendance, right? Things like, that are a little broader, like being a good representative of the organization. We often see people throw in here things like, attend the annual fundraising event, if able, participate actively in stewardship opportunities for our donors. If there's a give-get for the organization about how much board members are supposed to participate and contribute financially, that's usually included in here as well. So really just anything that we want to set as an expectation for them across the year. And the reason why this is really important is the number one reason we see for board staff miscommunication that ultimately leads to disengagement from board members often is that there's differing expectations, right? Staff think board are going to come in, raise all this money, participate in every event, right? Help out in a variety of ways. And board might think they're just going to show up, attend meetings, and write a check, right? And neither one's necessarily wrong there because they're both trying to help. They just have different ideas of what that help looks like. So it's important we have this individual commitment form to help kind of drive that aligning of expectations. This also allows for a lot easier accountability, right? If we have a couple of board members who maybe aren't showing up to meetings, aren't kind of responding to some of the fundraising requests we have, aren't hitting their give-get goals, any of that type of stuff, we're able to then kind of come back to them at the end of the year. Ideally, the board chair, but worst case, the executive director can come back to them at the end of the year and say, like, hey, look, you said you were going to do these things. Most of this didn't get done. Maybe this isn't the best time for you to be on the board, right? Or what can we do to help you be more successful at this next year, right? So either way, whether it's a corrective conversation or maybe this isn't the right space for you, that commitment form can be really helpful in creating that sense of expectation. It also allows board members too to know they're doing the right things, right? So a lot of times board may not be doing stuff because they don't know they're supposed to be. So this makes it very clear for them kind of what those expectations are, and they can plan ahead of time for their time commitment there. And again, the goal of this is to empower the board while remaining flexible. So we don't want to be overly prescriptive in this. We're not going to write it here like you're going to call 10 donors, right? So it is going to be broader than that because we want to allow for some flexibility. This isn't supposed to be kind of a legalistic contract. This is really just supposed to set out those expectations broadly about what we need from board members and what board members can expect from staff. A couple of tips and tricks here. This shouldn't just be about the financial expectation, right? So a lot of times that's what we end up talking about with boards, right? Is the board fundraising component. How much are they giving us, right? Or getting for us? But it should also include these other things as well, right? Attendance, engagement in other fundraising practices like calling or writing thank you letters to donors, and making sure that there's a well-rounded set of kind of here's what it means to be a good board member at our organization. There can be some level of customization to this. So we might have board members who specifically want to commit to doing some pro bono work, right, for the organization, especially if we're on a working board. We see this happen more often. So we can customize this and add those things in. We'll have some that are for everyone, like attendance and engagement, but we'll have others that are maybe skill-based that are specific to the board member. We often have questions around this form about give-get policies. We actually do recommend, and this has become about 50-50 in the sector, maybe a little bit less than that, but pretty close to it, that you don't have a specific give-get number. So a lot of times organizations, for understandable reasons, have to be on the board, you have to give $2,500 this year, right? Or get $2,500 for the organization. We often see that as a limiting number. If we take 10 people on our board, probably some of them could give more than the give-get, but might give less and just give it that number because we gave it to them. Other board members might be really great board members who can give just a little bit less than that, and we're losing out on those folks by having that number. So instead, we encourage folks to consider putting in here that the give-get is one of the top 3 gifts that board member makes, right? So that the organization has a philanthropic priority to them. but there isn't necessarily a number tied to it, but they are deciding their number when they sign the commitment form. So we know and we can plan for how much the board is going to raise. If you do have a specific number, totally fine, and you can put this in there and make it clear to them that they can kind of raise that or give that themselves. And the final thing I'll just say here, this last bullet point is important to know, is describing their role in fundraising beyond that number, right? Whether it's a priority number or whether it's a number we give to everybody, making sure they understand some of that stewardship stuff, the cultivation stuff, the thank you calls and things like that. Those are going to be expectations regardless of if they're giving 10K, 1K, or anything else that we need their help on, right? So we know donors respond really well to board involved stewardship. We want that kind of tool in our tool belt when we're thinking about donor stewardship. The second kind of structure piece we wanted to talk about, and this is one that I would say does not get used enough, but when we look at high performing boards that are really effective and are real resources for the organizations, almost universally, this is something that they've adopted. When we look at boards that are still struggling, right, or growing or having some engagement issues, this is almost universally not adopted. So this is in no way like a panacea that's going to fix all your board issues, but it is going to help a lot, which is board evaluation. So we think a lot about kind of executive director or staff evaluation, right? So all of our staff get evaluated. At most organizations, the board annually evaluates the executive director. Definitely should be doing that, and at most organizations they are doing that. But we see it happen a lot less often that the board is actually evaluating itself, right? So what this looks like is typically at least once a year, the board would complete evaluation. As you can see here in the second column is kind of two-tiered. So asking each board member to kind of self-evaluate their own performance, and then also asking each board member to evaluate the board's overall performance, right? So this is on things like board culture, engagement, right? Conversation and collaboration. There could be specific goals the board has that they're trying to achieve. So they're asking members to evaluate, did we achieve those goals? Often this will also include some staff feedback as well, right? So executive directors or senior staff that work with the board might answer some questions around this also. But the ideal here is that then in an executive session with kind of the board managing the board, which is how we ideally want this to go, that they're able to have a conversation around what are we doing well, what aren't we? And then ultimately, if we don't have goals currently, this initial evaluation can lead to setting some goals. So the same as we hold our executive directors accountable to achieving goals throughout the year, we want our board to also have some goals to achieve, right? They could be very tangible about how much money is raised or how many people they get to the annual event, or it could be higher level cultural, right? Like we want to drive towards 100% participation during board meetings, or we want to create a more collaborative culture, a more open culture on the board, and having some ideas about how to measure, kind of get a sense of that. So it's really important that we have this annual evaluation and these goals. This is going to make it feel more like a partnership with the executive director, right? Instead of just the board kind of does its own thing and then evaluates them once a year. Now both are kind of responsible for growth, as you would expect, right, at an organization that's growing. And hopefully this drives some self-accountability, right, for both individual board members to think about their performance, then also for the board as itself to think about its collective performance. So this is something we really recommend. We see can drive some really great conversations on the board and really kind of create some ownership pretty quickly a lot of times. And then the final tip I'll say is around job descriptions. So for board member job descriptions, so this is another opportunity, right, to clarify expectations. So if you don't have job descriptions or kind of position descriptions for your board members, we really encourage it. So usually there's at least one general job description for kind of just a regular board member, right? To just be on the board. Here's what we typically expect of our board members. We can use this for recruitment. So we'll actually talk about this again next week as well as a recruitment tool. So I won't go too deep into it today, but it can be really helpful for setting expectations before people even join. That's one thing you'll hear us talk about next week as well, is that it's a lot easier to have the right expectations from the beginning than to realign them after someone's been on the board for several years. So that's one thing we'll talk about next week. But it can also be used to hold kind of current members accountable a bit, or just remind them of what they signed up for, right? So a lot of times it's just helping them understand what is expected, right, in the first place. Structured really similar to a regular job description. You probably already have with the organization a template for it. The goal here is really outline the role and the impact, right? So we want to outline, here's what a board member typically does, right? A little bit of that governance and financial management we talked about earlier, so some broad language, and then some really specific examples, right, or specific instances of expectations, right? So we expect board members to attend 6 board meetings a year. We expect them to attend our annual fundraising event, be an active participant in the stewardship of donors. We expect all this to take, 3 to 4 hours a month, right? 2 to 3 hours, 5 to 6, whatever it is. Especially if it's a working board, really being upfront about the work that's required there, or being asked of them if they're joining. And again, not trying to be prescriptive, not trying to literally set out, here's everything you're going to ever have to do as a board member, but giving people some idea of the scope, right? What are they signing up for? Or if they're already on the board, what are they supposed to be doing, right? Getting some consensus around that. It can also be really helpful to do these job descriptions and tailor them a bit for our executive roles, right? So when we think about chair, president, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer, putting really specific job descriptions together for if you're going to step into that board chair role, here's all that encompasses, right? If you're going to be the secretary, here's all that encompasses. Again, the goal, similar to the general board member job description, is to be really specific on expectations and duties, probably a little bit more so in these leadership role ones. And again, this can both help people who are in those roles do those roles better, but can also actually take away some of the fear other board members might have about stepping into those leadership roles. A lot of times, again, if we don't set these out specifically, board members might think like, oh, well, I don't have time to be vice chair. I have a ton on my plate. That sounds overwhelming. But if they actually look at the job description and realize it's actually only like 3 or 4 extra things they have to do, they might be a lot more willing to step in that leadership role. We know a lot of organizations struggle with getting board members to sign up for those leadership opportunities. So one way to kind of encourage that sign up is to demystify it a bit, right? And give them a little bit more of a sense that this is actually doable. So job descriptions can be helpful with that. This is also something, and again, we'll talk about this next week, but sharing these in the onboarding process. Again, why we see board members sometimes not step up for leadership roles is they have an idea that's going to be a daunting responsibility, and it's definitely a real responsibility, but it's usually not that big of a lift. So we want to make sure that they're aware of that early on so they can be thinking about those leadership positions in the future. And then finally, having some job descriptions for our committee chairs. And it could just be one job description. It doesn't have to be by committee, right? But having one for anyone stepping up to the committee chair role. This is often the first leadership position someone will take on a board, right, as a stepping stone to kind of stepping into some of those executive positions. So this is where we're also focusing again on those specific responsibilities. And for this one specifically, we're really trying to talk both what's their role at committee meetings, right? And what's their role at full board meetings. So usually full board meetings, we're asked them kind of report out, be the one that owns that topic when we talk about it to the full board. Excuse me. But we also want to make sure at committee meetings, we're setting out that expectation a little bit too. And letting them know like that all the work doesn't fall on them. They're really a facilitator, right? So again, demystifying that role a bit is going to make more people interested and feel kind of eligible to take on that responsibility. So that's a little bit on, there's obviously other policies and structures, we can talk about bylaws, we can talk about term limits is a big thing we see organizations struggle with if they don't have them. Term limits really do drive engagement a bit, right? If I know I'm on the board for the rest of my life, it changes how much I engage. If I know I'm on there for a 2-year term up to 3 times, that allows me to be really focused, right, on what I'm getting done. So term limits can be a really helpful thing. If you don't have those yet, and we want to talk about how to add those in later, we can definitely do that during the Q&A part. So the next section we're going to spend some time on, and we'll dive actually pretty deep into relatively our committees. And the reason for this is that we actually see this as probably other than the individual commitment form possibly, the board evaluation, this is like the third thing we can do in terms of structure that really drives engagement. And for many boards is actually the most effective thing. So the board evaluation piece can be really helpful creating an ownership conversation. The individual commitment form can be really helpful on the individual level of driving accountability. But committees are where we really start seeing people form some connections with each other because they're smaller groups. They really get some work done, right? And as they see progress happens, they're more likely to stick around and stay engaged. So they have a lot of outsized benefit for doing them in terms of small group social connection that's going to happen, that's going to cause engagement, work in progress being done that's going to cause engagement. And a lot of times you can get some wins that can be celebrated, right? It's also going to cause that engagement. So how about how to set these up and how to really make these effective? The first thing is thinking about just how to set up our committees, right? So if you are starting from a place where you don't have committees, or maybe you have them, but they're not very active, right? Like we have them in name only. I don't know the last time they met, right? You are in good company. That is many boards that are out there. And if you do have kind of thriving committees, this might be a good opportunity to kind of recapture interest, right, and re-engage on some of these things. So the first tip here is making sure we get those committees again off to a solid start or off to a solid restart if we already have them. All committees should be board voted and officially approved, right? So even ad hoc committees, which we'll talk about in a second, should be kind of voted on by the full board, approved by the full board. The two types of committees that you're going to hear us talk about today, standing committees, right? So standing committees are long-term. These are committees that are meant to be there for the rest of the time of the organization, right? You can always change your mind later as a board, but usually these are committees that have at least a 2-year time horizon, right? So something like a development committee. I'm not going to stop fundraising anytime soon. So that's probably going to be important as long as the organization's around and as long as we have enough board members to staff that committee. So development, finance committee is one we always see. Executive committee is one we always see. So we'll talk more about which ones we often see or not, but those long-standing committees are one type. The other type is the ad hoc committee, which doesn't always get used as much as it should on boards. We actually see this as a real opportunity for engagement a lot of times. And ad hoc committees are time bound. So these are usually for projects that are going to be a year or less. They can be renewed. So sometimes they become longer term, but they usually have a really specific time and a really specific goal, right? So you might be entering into a strategic planning process. So you have an ad hoc committee that's going to guide that process, right? Maybe you're doing branding, right? So you have an ad hoc committee that's focused on that. You could have an event coming up. So you have an ad hoc event committee that again is going to exist from now until your event, is going to help steward that, right? Shepherd that, get sponsors and donors, etc. And then we'll dissolve post-event. So it's important that we're thinking about which one of these makes sense for us. A lot of times we get questions about how many committees I should have. So pretty much every board has an executive committee, right? And kind of has to, with like chair, vice chair, secretary, and treasurer. Most boards then also have a finance committee, right? So the treasurer and a couple other board members looking at the finances. We usually see a governance committee. So this is the group that's usually looking at board recruitment, usually looking at like policies, practices, board management, right? Making sure we stick to the things we've committed to, all that type of stuff. Those would be the three most common. A strong fourth that we see often is a development committee. And those would really be the 4 standing committees we often see. Depending on the organization, there might be more, also depending on the size of the board. But if you imagine having at least 3 people, if not 4 folks on each committee and serving on 1 or 2 committees at most, those 3 or 4 standing within 1 or 2 ad hoc at a time usually fill out the space, right? So we don't want to just create committees to create them. So keeping it to 3 or 4 standing is usually a good practice. With 1 or 2 ad hoc, depending on what projects we're working on. So when the board's going to vote on these, you want to send the charter ahead of time. We'll talk about what the committee charter is in a second. We want to make sure people are basically informed about what committees we would be launching. Probably the most important part of this slide and that I can say about getting a committee off the ground, or even if you have thriving committees that exist right now, if you don't have committee charters, taking some time to create them can be really important. This is an important part of sustainability over time as well. I'll talk about why. But a committee charter is a one-page outline of basically what the committee does, right? What the committee's role is, what its impact can be, focusing on kind of how long it should be active. So if it's standing or ad hoc, and if it's ad hoc, is it 3 months, 6 months, 12 months? What the main focus is, kind of like the mission statement of the committee, basically. Key responsibilities or outcomes, right? So if we think back to that strategic planning ad hoc committee example, the key outcome is going to be a strat plan at the end of this. Some of the key responsibilities during it are going to be engaging and involving the board in the process, working with the ED and consultant to make sure we stay on timeline, et cetera, right? But thinking about what are those big things the committee is going to need to do to achieve that key outcome in line with the mission statement. This often also will set out kind of how big the committee will be or some expectation. It doesn't have to be prescriptively to a specific number, but usually will set out, this committee will have at least 3 board members and no more than 6, right? So helping set a little bit of a scope of the size of it. Most committees, I'll say, typically range in that 3 to 6 size. The only difference of that is we often see event committees be a lot larger, and we can talk about why a little later. And then also include things like meeting frequency, if we're going to allow ex officio members, so people from outside the board to serve on it, and anything like that. And then finally, and this goes along with the voting part of it, but just make sure there's real buy-in for this committee, right? So usually we want to make sure there's at least 1 or 2 folks that we know want to serve on it, right? If I'm launching a committee that no one wants to be on, it's not going to be a very successful committee. So I want to make sure that I already have some kind of pre-commitments from people that are going to serve. Hopefully I already have a pre-commitment for someone that wants to be chair, right? If possible. So I know there's someone that's going to step up to lead it. And I want to run this by my exec committee ahead of time and then the whole board, right? So there's kind of layers of buy-in there. For committees kind of getting stuff done, right, and driving projects. So again, ideally, committees on a board is actually where work gets done. Whether you're a working board or a governance, committees are driving stuff forward. And then the full board is really just reviewing it, approving it, and, discussing any kind of big issues. But the committees are really kind of the lifeblood of the board, if kind of fully engaged, fully working as it should. So we want to be really specific with committees about kind of what the deliverable is, right? What do we want them to accomplish? When do we want them to finish it by? What's the result going to look like, right? We want to use the meetings of the committee and deadlines to set some expectations. So in terms of how often committees meet, we typically see most committees sign up to meet kind of monthly. Depending on the topic, the board, the culture, it might be more like bi-monthly or quarterly. But really the goal of committees is that, this is an opportunity for a small group of board members to get to know each other really well, to work alongside each other and get something done. So that kind of monthly frequency is usually important to kind of build those relationships and build that culture and expectation. And then finally, even if you're a standing committee, right, exec, finance, development, it's really important that at least every other year, if not every year, we're kind of recommitting what that mission is, kind of updating the charter, right, resetting the projects that people are moving forward, because we want to make sure for both standing and ad hoc committees, they have really specific expectations, right, that they're working against. 2 things we want to avoid here. Even though committees are getting work done, unless you're on a real kind of grassroots working board, we still want to make sure the board stays above kind of staff operations, right? So we're not using these committees to necessarily replace or do staff work in most cases. Again, working boards are going to blur that line a little bit, but typically we're trying to use these committees to move strategic projects forward, right? Something like strat planning, or something like our development committee might be moving forward a major prospect research thing, right? That again blurs the line a bit. Staff could do it, but maybe we don't have any development staff on the team. So we need the board to step up and help with that. But it's doing things like that kind of prospect research thing that's going to add capacity to the organization. So capacity building projects are often what we see. these committees do, or strategic work. And then finally, the other thing we want to avoid here is that it's just kind of, open-ended, right? So a development committee that just doesn't really have any projects or expectations or deadlines. They just kind of exist to talk every couple of months about fundraising. That usually isn't going to produce very good outcomes, right? So we want to make sure that every committee has kind of its own little work plan for the year, that they're going to drive something forward, so there's something tangible. Not only will that create better results for the staff and the organization, but it also gives them more sense of progress, right? That they're engaged and involved. Third tip here around who to get on your committees, right? The biggest question often is kind of board versus non-board, right? So for pretty much any standing committee, it's just going to be voting board members, right? We wouldn't really invite folks from the community to sit on our governance committee, for instance, right? That's a pretty important leadership role. So that's going to be for only kind of selected board members. But a lot of times they're ad hoc committees. So you can imagine, we have a marketing ad hoc committee. We really want to focus for the next 6 months on how to get our name more out there in the community. We may or may not have marketing expertise on our board. So maybe we have 2 or 3 board members who are willing to step into that, think about that. Maybe they do have some expertise in it, but maybe we have 1 or 2 volunteers, folks we just know, right? Contacts we have that are great at marketing, right? They're social media managers, they work in comms or PR. So we bring them on as ex officio board members, which means that they're non-voting. So they're not kind of a full board member, but they then can serve on that committee, right? So they don't attend full board meetings typically. They don't vote on anything, but they're there to kind of help that working group, kind of like a pro bono volunteer again. So that's a big decision to make for any individual committee. Typically, again, that's reserved for ad hoc committees. Doesn't have to be, but typically is. And for both the shorter ad hoc committees and the event committees, can be really helpful at bringing some outside folks to help bring in more sponsors, donors, knowledge, expertise. More people on the committee obviously make the work easier because you can divide it up more, but also make scheduling harder, as we all are aware. So typically, again, as we said earlier, the ideal size for a committee, generally speaking, is 3 to 5 folks. Can change, but kind of 3 is a minimum, right? If you have 2, it's not really a committee. And no more than like 5 or 6 typically, unless it's an event committee. In terms of skills, we want to think about is the work the committee is going to do requiring some specific skills or experiences in the background, right? So again, that strat planning example, we probably want at least one of those members who have gone through or done strategic planning before. If they're all new to it, that might be a required necessity of our board, but it's going to make it a lot more difficult. Will certain networks or perspectives or identities be helpful? So thinking about diversity here, but then also just scope and reach of who our board members know. And also thinking about time, right? If it's going to be a committee that really requires a heavy time commitment, I probably want to lean more on my engaged board members than trying to bring in folks who maybe aren't doing that much already. And then finally, just setting some really strong goals here, right? So setting goals for the work and making sure the people we bring on are excited about achieving those goals. And the final thing here around committees is just sharing ownership, right? So the goal is that we're not just kind of sending them off into the wild to do something and then we don't really hear much about it. It's really trying to create a culture of ownership. And this is where committees can really change our culture of engagement on the board. Having a chair for the committee, whether that's chosen by the committee itself, full board vote, just the exec chooses somebody. We want that person to really be a facilitator and organizer. They're going to have separate conversations with the board and chair. They're going to be a kind of leader of that small group of the board, right? Not only is that great for moving work forward, but that means that someone's thinking about the engagement of 3 to 5 of our board members at a time, right? So not just kind of the chair. Now we have individual leaders on the board. At the board meetings, we want the agenda to be largely based around our committees, right? Because our committees are based largely around our strategic goals and objectives. And committee chairs actually can own that reporting out, right? At the ideal meeting, we'll talk about this at our 3rd session. At the ideal board meeting, it's not just the ED or board chair talking for the full time. We can actually hand over parts of the agenda to these committee chairs that can drive the conversation forward. And again, we may not have enough engaged members that every committee chair is willing to do that. But even if we can just get one committee to start doing that, that can really be a cultural shift for the board, right? And other people start realizing they need to step up. And the final piece here, then we'll pause for questions from everyone, is around just driving engagement itself. So just a quick reminder, right, that for all these things about structure and policies and accountability, remembering that our board members are volunteers, right? At the end of the day, they don't get paid for this. They are donors. They are volunteers. They are doing this probably because they believe in the mission, at least somewhat, of the organization, right? And they want to be there and they're voluntarily being there. So it's just important we remember that as executive directors, even as board chairs that are maybe really invested in it, that not everyone might be that invested. So we want to make sure we're checking in with board members, kind of like we would with any major donor, right? So at least twice a year doing that check-in where we're asking them, how they're doing, how the family is, right? How work is. Getting a sense of that stuff isn't just the right thing to do and engaging for them, but also is going to give us some information that's helpful. Knowing like, oh, hey, that sounds like a lot's going on, personal, professional life. I'll understand if you're not at our next meeting, or like, I'll understand if you're a little disengaged this quarter. Asking for their advice in these check-ins is always a great thing to do. It reminds them that we care about their opinion, right? Care about what they're thinking about. And then make sure we're getting their thoughts, especially right now. There's so much uncertainty, reopening, not reopening, right? All that type of stuff. So it's important we're getting a sense of how they're feeling about the direction of the organization, since things have probably changed a lot over the last year. So with that, I'll go ahead and pause for any questions folks have. We have about 12 minutes left to kind of take any questions everyone has. These are just some quick next steps. So if you want to get started on some of these board structure engagement changes, these are some great places to get started.
Thanks, Matt. I've had a number of questions that have come in directly to me. And so I'll get started with those. I think it's interesting to note we have a kind of a compelling mix of board members that have joined us today, as well as executive directors and staff, individuals who are staff. And we also have quite a range in terms of size of organization represented. So I think we'll see some of that come through in these questions. The first question here is, what is the role of board members in setting the meeting agenda? And of course, that probably varies depending on the size of the organization and that type of thing that I just spoke about. But can you touch on that?
Yeah, definitely. So, and I always talk about this as the ideal process and the realistic process, right? So ideally, the executive director, in partnership with the staff, is thinking about kind of what's really important right now. The executive director sets a draft agenda, meets with the board chair to discuss it, probably has some edits right to that and stuff. From the board chair and ED, they then go to the exec committee, talk about it, get buy-in that this is what we want to talk about the next meeting, and then they send it out to the board at least a week ahead of time so the board gets ready for it. Then they kind of go into the conversation. We know a lot of times organizations may not have the capacity of board leadership, right, to have that back and forth. So maybe the ED is setting it. On the other hand, we might have organizations with really strong boards that are leading the process for the board agenda. But typically we recommend ED kind of says like, hey, here's the big things we see right now we need to be talking about. Board chair, exec input, and then goes to the full board.
Next question, can you talk a little more about how much work should be delegated to subcommittees? Some things seem too important to delegate to the subcommittee and should be handled at the full board level.
Definitely, yeah. So there are definitely topics like, for instance, like budget's a great example, right? We're always going to have that conversation at the full board. We're going to approve it at the full board, dive into it. But a lot of the pre-work for the budget can be done in finance committee, right? Can be done in a smaller group. So that's often what we see for a lot of these bigger topics, right? Strategic planning is a great example. Obviously, it's going to be a full board topic where the full board is strongly engaged in every step of the process. But a strategic planning ad hoc committee is going to be the smaller group of 3 to 4 board members that are responsible for working with the consultant and ED to move stuff forward, right? Or if a couple of board members aren't responding, are going to be the ones that take it on themselves to call them and kind of re-engage them. So a lot of times the subcommittees are moving big projects forward in the background, so then the full board can engage more strategically with it when they come together.
And maybe a specific example of this is I've heard from a couple of local organizations is many organizations are having increased conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and some organizations are struggling with whether or not that should be a subcommittee conversation, or that should be, elevated to the full board. And so I know that that's a point that organizations are grappling with right now.
Definitely. And I'll just say on that, because we actually have had organizations ask us, which way they should go there. There's not a right or wrong answer. If you end up making a DEI committee, just making sure the pitfall we see with that is that then it feels like sometimes for some boards now, like 3 people are thinking about it and everyone else can kind of check out, right? So it's really important that that stays a board level priority and that committee is just driving it, right? But the whole board's still responsible for it. The other way we've seen people do that is editing every kind of committee charter to have an equity component, so that everyone kind of feels that joint responsibility.
Yeah. Good question here, and probably one that there's no magic wand to wave, but we're an all voluntary organization. It's a challenge to carry out the activities of the organization while also governing the organization. You talked about working boards and governance boards. What recommendations do you have to help us actually make that transition from working to governance?
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing, especially if you're an all volunteer organization to begin with, I think too often governance boards are positioned as like the ideal, right? If you have one staff or no paid staff, being a fully governance board probably isn't necessarily a realistic answer for you in the short term, right? So the more important thing is really thinking about how are we still doing our working board responsibilities, right? Those specific projects, but making sure we're also separately hitting our kind of governance roles. So the big thing there, I would say, is making sure we have at least 1 or 2 folks that are really focused on our finances, that the whole board is engaged in reading those financial reports. That's a big shift we see when the whole board takes responsibility for that and responsibility for kind of understanding what is a profit and loss statement when I'm looking at it, right, and not just kind of glancing over it. And then making sure just that you're thinking really carefully about growth for the organization. That's the other kind of governance that we often see for all volunteer organization, how to grow sustainably, being realistic with our resources.
Another question from a smaller all voluntary organization. As a no staff organization, we rely on our board members to be ambassadors for the organization and to serve as connectors, mainly for fundraising help. Do you have examples of very small organizations that have really used board members effectively in those roles?
Yeah, I think often when we think about some of our smaller organizations we work with, they're either all volunteer or below 100K, 200K budgets that have been effective with using their boards in that way to grow. Make sure that they're really empowering their board members with resources to go out there. Not everyone's a natural fundraiser. So making sure that, if someone's passionate about your cause and wants to fundraise but doesn't really know how, that we're giving them some templates, right? We're giving them a conversation guide. Maybe next time we meet, we're actually doing some role playing, right? Where we practice our fundraising pitch on each other. So there's some tools and templates we can give to make those board members more confident in that. The other piece of that is like networking, right? So working with our board members, think about what networks do you specifically touch that others don't, that you can uniquely go out to.
Can you talk about the true legal responsibility of nonprofit boards?
Yeah, so there is, again, kind of the formal name for this, right? Fiduciary responsibility. At the end of the day, the board is responsible for the, proper management of the resources, right? That the resources are being used for identified and approved charitable purposes, and that if there are any type of issues and kind of management issues at the organization, the board is responsible for those. That's why we have D&O insurance, right? Director and officer insurance. So that is kind of the legal responsibility of the board. Often for most boards, in 99% of cases, that will never come up. But it is something important that board members realize when they sign up. This isn't just like a fun volunteer gig. There is technically that kind of legal component to it, right? And that this is a formal leadership role.
Just a couple more questions here. You mentioned the commitment form. Can you share that with us?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to send you all a template and you can send it out to folks.
Yeah, I'd be happy to include that in our follow-up email. Good question there. And then finally, which is one that you may dive into in our third session about running better board meetings. But this person is asking, do you recommend strictly following Robert's Rules of Order?
Got it. No, is my short answer there. But I will say, both our next topics around recruitment and board meeting management are two things that are just critical to board engagement. So it's actually hard to talk about board engagement without touching on those more than I did today. So we'll talk about those at the next two meetings. But for board meetings in general, Robert's rules are a great kind of structure for it. It can drive some efficiency. But typically speaking, for most boards, especially for smaller organizations, we don't need to be quite that formulaic. So we can take things from it about how we vote, how we approve stuff. But usually we're kind of mixing that with some reality as well.
Great. Well, thank you all for submitting those questions. These are just really, thoughtfully put, and I think some pressing issues there. Matt, is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up?
No, I think again we're looking forward to the next two. Really diving into recruitment, how we get the right folks on the board, and equally importantly, how we onboard them, and then finally ending with board meetings, which we know are critical to engagements. We're looking forward to it. Thank you all.
Yep. Thanks a lot, Matt. And I just have to say to the group, I'm not sure I mentioned it earlier, but the organization that you work for really focuses on smaller organizations. Now, that word means something different in Washington, D.C., but what that means for us is that you're working with organizations that represent the bulk of the size of our membership that we serve as well. So really appreciate your perspective, and hopefully those of you that are all voluntary were able to take away some lessons today, all the way up to those of you who have maybe multiple staff members and larger operating budgets. So we appreciate your perspective, Matt, and we appreciate everybody who attended today. As you mentioned earlier, a follow-up evaluation will be sent by email along with today's recording. We encourage you to visit dcmp.org, follow us on Facebook for upcoming trainings and opportunities. We have a lot coming up that you all can take advantage of. Next week, we'll have our second part in this series, as Matt mentioned, and he's going to be exploring those themes of recruiting and engaging your board members. That's on August 12th at 9 a.m. And you can register for that by visiting dcmp.org. We've dropped that in the chat as well, so you have a direct link there. I hope you'll join us for that next week. So once again, I want to thank you for attending, and a big thank you goes to Matt for sharing his time and expertise with all of us today.